At 73 years old, Eleanor Hayes had carried a secret that felt heavier than the Pennsylvania winters she'd endured all her life. The weight of silence had pressed against her chest for over 6 decades, growing heavier with each passing year. Today, sitting in her small living room in Cedar Falls, surrounded by photographs of grandchildren and the gentle hum of an afternoon that felt like any other, she finally found the courage to speak. Her weathered hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her reading glasses. The decision to share her story hadn't come easily. For 60 years, she had buried the truth so deep that sometimes she wondered if it had been a nightmare, a terrible dream that had somehow convinced her it was real. But the scars remained, invisible to the world, but etched permanently into her soul. "My name is Eleanor Hayes," she began, her voice steady despite the storm brewing in her memories. "But everyone who knows me calls me Grandma Elle. I was born in the autumn of 1952 in Millbrook, a small suburb outside Pittsburgh where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were supposed to be impossible to keep. The irony of that last thought wasn't lost on her. Millbrook had been this kind of place where neighbors borrowed sugar and knew when someone's light stayed on too late. Yet the worst secret of all had festered right under everyone's noses, hidden behind the facade of a normal American family. Eleanor's childhood had begun like something from a storybook. Her father, William Hayes, was a truck driver who hauled freight across Pennsylvania and into neighboring states. He was a gentle giant of a man with calloused hands that could fix anything and eyes that lit up whenever he saw his only daughter. Her mother, Margaret, took in sewing from the wealthy families in town, transforming their small house into a symphony of whirring machines and colorful fabrics that danced on clotheslines in the backyard. The Hayes family lived in a modest 3-bedroom house on Maple Street, painted white with green shutters that Margaret insisted on repainting every spring. Eleanor was the youngest and only girl among 4 children. Her brothers Daniel, Michael, and Christopher were 19, 18, 17, and 15 respectively when Eleanor's story truly began. William Hayes had always said that having a daughter after 3 sons was God's way of giving him a special blessing. Eleanor had been his little princess from the moment she drew her first breath. He would return from long hauls with his shirt pocket bulging with candy, always something special saved just for her. Even when she grew too big, he continued carrying her in his strong arms, spinning her around the living room until she giggled with pure joy. When William was home, their house felt complete. The family would gather around the dinner table, sharing stories of their days while Margaret's homemade bread filled the air with warmth. Daniel would talk about his job at the local garage. Michael would share gossip from high school. And Christopher would usually remain quiet, sketching in the margins of his notebook. Eleanor would sit between her parents, feeling safer than she'd ever feel again. But by 1965, William's roots were getting longer. The trucking company had expanded their territory, and the money was better for the extended hauls. What used to be 3 or 4 day trips stretched into weeks. Sometimes William would be gone for 20 days at a time, his absence leaving a hole in the family's rhythm that everyone felt but no one talked about. Margaret tried to maintain normalcy during her husband's absences. She kept busy with her sewing, taking on more clients to help with the bills. The house remained filled with the sound of her Singer sewing machine and the rustle of fabric, but something essential was missing. The protective presence that William provided simply couldn't be replaced. Eleanor remembered March 15th, 1965, with the kind of clarity reserved for moments that split a life into before and after. It had been an unseasonably warm day for Pennsylvania, with the first hints of spring teasing through the lingering winter cold. Margaret had bundled up a delivery of finished alterations for Mrs. Patterson, one of her most demanding clients who lived on the other side of town. "Take care of the house while I'm gone, Eleanor," Margaret had said, adjusting her hat in the hallway mirror. "Your brothers will be here if you need anything. I should be back before dinner. But Mrs. Patterson always wants to chat." Eleanor had nodded, already planning to spend the afternoon working on her homework and maybe reading the new Nancy Drew book she'd borrowed from the school library. At 13, she was an excellent student, the kind of girl teachers praised for her attention to detail and quiet intelligence. The house felt different the moment Margaret's footsteps faded down the front walk. Eleanor couldn't have explained why, but something in the air shifted. She tried to shake off the feeling as she settled at the kitchen table with her mathematics homework, but concentration proved impossible. It was while she stood at the kitchen sink, washing the lunch dishes and watching soap bubbles swirl down the drain, that she felt someone approach from behind. The footsteps were too heavy to be her mother returning early, and they moved with a purpose that made the hair on her arms stand up. Eleanor. Daniel's voice carried a tone she'd never heard before, something that made her stomach clench with instinctive fear. You're really growing up, aren't you? Becoming quite the young lady. She tried to turn around, but Daniel's hand suddenly gripped her shoulders, holding her in place. His fingers pressed hard enough to leave marks, and Eleanor felt panic begin to rise in her chest like flood water. Daniel, what are you doing? She managed to whisper, her voice sounding small and frightened even to her own ears. Let me go. I need to finish the dishes. That's when she heard the kitchen door creak open behind them. For a moment, hope flared in her chest. Maybe it was Michael coming to help her, to tell Daniel to stop whatever strange game he was playing. But when she saw Michael's face, the smile that spread across his features made her blood turn to ice. Looks like our little sister is finally ready to learn some grown-up lessons, Michael said, and Eleanor realized with growing horror that this wasn't a game at all. This was something they had planned, something they had discussed and decided on while she remained blissfully unaware. Christopher appeared in the doorway moments later, leaning against the frame with an expression Eleanor had never seen on his face before. He was only 2 years older than her, still just a boy himself, but the look in his eyes belonged to someone much older and infinitely more dangerous. Mum won't be back for hours, Michael announced with casual certainty. Mrs. Patterson will keep her talking until well past dinner time. And Dad's not due back from his run until next week. The words hit Eleanor like physical blows. They had planned this. They had watched and waited and calculated exactly when they would have enough time to do whatever it was they intended to do. The realization that her own brothers, the boys who had grown up in the same house, eaten at the same table, shared the same parents, could look at her with such cold calculation was more terrifying than anything she could have imagined. What happened in that kitchen over the next hour would haunt Eleanor Hayes for the rest of her life. The details were too painful, too violating, too devastating to reconstruct in their entirety, but the essential horror remained crystal clear. The 3 people who should have protected her had instead become her predators. When it was over, Eleanor lay on the cold linoleum floor, her clothes torn and her spirit shattered in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. Christopher, who had been the last to participate, crouched down beside her with an expression that might have been remorse, if not for the words that followed. "If you tell anyone what happened here today," he said quietly, his young voice carrying a coldness that belonged to someone much older, "no one will believe you. They'll say you wanted it. They'll say you're a liar trying to get attention." The threat hung in the air like poison as the 3 brothers left her alone on the kitchen floor. Eleanor remained there for nearly an hour, unable to move, unable to cry, unable to process what had been stolen from her. When she finally managed to pull herself upright, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand, she stumbled to the bathroom and stood under the shower until the hot water ran out. By the time Margaret returned home that evening, chattering about Mrs. Patterson's latest gossip and the other clients she'd encountered in town, Eleanor had managed to compose herself enough to pretend normalcy. The performance required every ounce of strength she possessed. "Is everything all right, sweetheart?" Margaret asked, noticing the shadows under Eleanor's eyes. "You look pale. Just a headache." "Mom," Eleanor replied, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "I think I studied too hard today." That night, Eleanor pushed her dresser against her bedroom door and lay in bed staring at the ceiling, knowing that sleep would bring nightmares, and waking would bring the terrible knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again. The little girl who had been William Hayes's princess was gone, replaced by someone who now understood that the world contained horrors she'd never imagined possible. The next morning brought no relief. Margaret left early for the farmer's market, her weekly routine as predictable as sunrise. Eleanor tried to barricade herself in her room again, but the dresser proved no match for Daniel's determination. "No point in locking yourself away, little sister," Daniel said as he shoved the door open, sending the dresser scraping sweeping across the wooden floor. "This is our house too, and we're your big brothers. We're just looking out for you." Michael and Christopher filed in behind him, and Eleanor realized with sinking horror that yesterday hadn't been an isolated incident. It had been the beginning of something systematic, something that would continue as long as they had opportunity, and she had no power to stop them. The pattern that emerged over the following weeks was as calculated as it was devastating. The brothers had studied their parents' routines with scientific precision. They knew that Margaret delivered finished sewing to clients every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, often staying to chat with neighbours afterward. They knew she spent at least 2 hours at the Saturday market, visiting with friends and carefully selecting the best produce. They knew exactly when William would be away on his increasingly frequent long-haul routes. Eleanor began to change in ways that everyone noticed, but no one understood. The bright, talkative girl who had always been eager to share her day gradually became a shadow of herself. Her appetite disappeared, and the weight loss was so dramatic that her clothes hung loose on her shrinking frame. Dark circles appeared under her eyes, permanent reminders of the sleep that eluded her night after night. At school, her grades plummeted from A's to C's and worse. Teachers who had once praised her attention to detail and insightful questions now watched with concern as she stared out windows or dozed at her desk. Eleanor Hayes, who had always been one of the most engaged students in her class, began skipping school entirely, forging sick notes in her mother's handwriting. "What's happening to you, Eleanor?" Mrs. Morrison, her favourite teacher, asked one afternoon after keeping her behind when the other students left for the day. "You used to be so enthusiastic about everything. Now you seem like you're somewhere else entirely." Eleanor wanted desperately to tell the truth in that moment. Mrs. Morrison had kind eyes and a gentle voice, and she'd always made Eleanor feel safe in her classroom. But Christopher's words echoed in her mind like a curse. "No one will believe you." And gradually, Eleanor began to believe them herself. Maybe she had done something to encourage this. Maybe it was somehow her fault. At home, she began dressing differently, choosing baggy, shapeless clothes that hid her developing figure. She cut her hair short without asking permission, earning a sharp rebuke from Margaret, who had always loved brushing her daughter's long thigh. Dark waves. Eleanor stopped smiling, stopped humming the songs she used to love, stopped doing all the little things that had made her distinctly herself. But nothing she did made any difference. If anything, her attempts to make herself invisible only seemed to amuse her brothers. They had claimed her as their victim, and they weren't going to let anything as simple as her obvious distress deter them from taking whatever they wanted. The psychological manipulation was as cruel as the physical abuse. Daniel, as the oldest and the clear leader of the group, proved particularly skilled at twisting Eleanor's perceptions of reality. After particularly violent episodes, he would hold her face in his hands and speak to her in a mockingly gentle voice. "You know what would happen if you tried to tell Dad about our special time together, don't you?" he would ask, his grip tight enough to leave fingerprint bruises on her cheeks. "We'd have to tell him how you've been flirting with older boys at school, how you've been acting inappropriate, trying to get attention from any male who'll look at you." The lies were systematic and believable. The brothers began creating elaborate stories for Margaret's benefit, painting Eleanor as a troubled teenager who was acting out in increasingly concerning ways. "Mum, I think you should know that Eleanor was talking to some older guys down by the corner store yesterday," Michael would announce at dinner, his voice filled with false concern. "They looked like they might be in their 20s. I tried to tell her it wasn't appropriate, but she just laughed at me." Margaret would turn worried eyes to Eleanor, searching her daughter's face for signs of the rebellion her sons described. "Is this true? Eleanor, are you spending time with older boys?" "No, Mum," Eleanor would protest, her voice barely above a whisper. "I swear it's not true. I don't even talk to boys at school." But Daniel would shake his head sadly, playing his role perfectly. "We saw it. Mum, we're just worried about her. She's been acting so strange lately." Gradually, the brothers succeeded in poisoning Margaret's relationship with her daughter. Instead of seeing Eleanor's withdrawal and distress as signs that something was terribly wrong, Margaret began to view them as evidence of teenage defiance and inappropriate behaviour. She started watching Eleanor more closely, but not in the way her daughter desperately needed. She watched for signs of the troublemaking her sons described, not for signs of the trauma they were inflicting. The only thing that gave Eleanor any hope during those terrible months was the thought of her father's return. When William was home, the brothers wouldn't dare approach her. They transformed back into normal teenage boys, playing their parts so convincingly that Eleanor sometimes wondered if she had imagined the whole thing. But William's visits home were becoming shorter and less frequent. The trucking company had offered him premium routes that kept him on the road for weeks at a time. The money was too good to turn down, especially with 4 children to feed and a mortgage to pay. He had no way of knowing that his absence was enabling a horror beyond his worst nightmares. Eleanor's body began showing signs that it couldn't endure much more. She developed irregular bleeding that had nothing to do with her normal cycle, cramping pains that would double her over without warning, and fevers that came and went without any apparent cause. She tried to hide these symptoms, terrified that seeking help would somehow expose what was happening to her. The end came on a night in late May. After an assault that was more violent than any that had come before, all 3 brothers had participated with a brutality that suggested they were growing bored with their usual routine and needed to escalate to maintain their satisfaction. When it was over, Eleanor began bleeding heavily. This wasn't the manageable bleeding she'd experienced before. This was something catastrophic. She crawled to the bathroom and collapsed on the tile floor, watching her blood pool around her and wondering if this was how she was going to die. The last thing she remembered before losing consciousness was Christopher's panicked voice calling for his brothers, his words filled with a terror that finally matched her own. "Daniel, Michael, come here right now. I think this time we went too far. Fan tui, sự suy sụp và khủng hoảng." The sound of panic in Christopher's voice cut through the house like a siren. Eleanor drifted in and out of consciousness on the cold bathroom tiles, her life seeming to ebb away with each drop of blood that pooled beneath her. She could hear her brothers' frantic whispers, their voices sharp with fear that had nothing to do with concern for her well-being and everything to do with self-preservation. "Jesus Christ, what did we do?" Michael's voice cracked with terror as he stared at Eleanor's motionless form. The bathroom looked like a crime scene, with blood smeared across the white tiles and Eleanor's face pale as death. Daniel, always the leader, even in crisis, immediately began calculating their next move. "We need to clean this up. Now, if anyone finds out what happened here, we're finished. All of us." They worked with desperate efficiency, cleaning the bathroom and changing Eleanor's clothes while she remained barely conscious. Christopher, the youngest, kept checking her pulse with shaking fingers, his face wet with tears he couldn't control. "She's barely breathing," he whispered. "What if she dies? What if we killed her? Shut up and help us get her to bed." Daniel snapped, but even his voice betrayed the fear that was consuming all of them. "We'll say she fell down the back stairs, that she hit her head, and that's why there was blood." They carried Eleanor to her bedroom and laid her on the bed, pulling the covers up to her chin to hide the evidence of what they'd done. The bleeding had slowed, but hadn't stopped entirely, and her breathing remained shallow and irregular. "Maybe we should call a doctor," Christopher suggested, his young voice breaking with guilt and terror. "She looks really bad." "Are you insane?" Michael hissed. "The first thing a doctor would do is examine her. They'd know immediately what happened. We'd all go to prison." Daniel paced the small bedroom like a caged animal, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. "We stick to the story. She fell down the stairs, hit her head. That's all anyone needs to know." By some miracle that Eleanor would later attribute to divine intervention, William Hayes chose that night to return home early from his route. He'd managed to complete his deliveries ahead of schedule and decided to surprise his family by arriving a day early. He pulled his truck into the driveway just after midnight, exhausted but happy to be home. As was his custom after long trips, William went straight to Eleanor's room to give her a goodnight kiss. He moved quietly through the darkened house, not wanting to wake Margaret, and pushed open Eleanor's bedroom door with the gentle touch of a father who'd missed his little girl. Something was wrong immediately, even in the darkness. He could sense it. Eleanor's breathing was too shallow, too labored. When he reached for the bedside lamp and turned it on, the sight that met his eyes would haunt him for the rest of his life. Eleanor lay motionless on blood-soaked sheets, her skin grey and clammy, her lips nearly blue. The metallic smell of blood filled the room, and William could see dark stains on her nightgown that told a story too horrible to comprehend. Eleanor, Eleanor, wake up! William's voice cracked with panic as he shook his daughter gently, afraid that any sudden movement might cause more damage. His hands came away sticky with blood, and the sight nearly brought him to his knees. Margaret, Margaret, get in here right now. His voice echoed through the house with an urgency that brought his wife running from their bedroom, her hair in curlers and her face creased with sleep. Margaret appeared in the doorway and immediately began screaming. The sight of her daughter lying in a pool of blood, barely clinging to life, shattered something fundamental in her psyche. What happened? Oh God, what happened to our baby? Margaret's hands fluttered helplessly over Eleanor's still form, afraid to touch her, but unable to stay away. William's mind raced through possibilities, none of them making sense. Call an ambulance, now, and then wake the boys. I want to know what happened here tonight. As Margaret ran to make the emergency call, William cradled Eleanor's head in his lap, whispering desperate promises and prayers. Hang on, Princess. Daddy's here now. You're going to be okay. I promise you're going to be okay. Eleanor's eyes fluttered open briefly, focusing on her father's face with tremendous effort. She tried to smile, tried to tell him how glad she was that he'd come home, but the words came out as barely audible whispers. Daddy! Help me, she managed, before consciousness slipped away again. The ambulance arrived within 10 minutes, but it felt like hours to William as he held his dying daughter and tried to understand how his world had collapsed so completely in the space of a few moments. The paramedics worked quickly and efficiently, establishing an IV line and checking Eleanor's vital signs, while asking questions that William couldn't answer. How long has she been like this? One of them asked while his partner prepared Eleanor for transport. I don't know. I just got home and found her this way, William replied, his voice hollow with shock and fear. By this time, all three boys had appeared in Eleanor's bedroom, summoned by the chaos and the flashing lights of the ambulance. William studied their faces in the harsh glare of the paramedic's flashlight, looking for answers, for some explanation of what had happened to his daughter. Daniel stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, his expression carefully controlled. Michael leaned against the wall, his face pale, but his eyes calculating. Christopher hung back behind his older brothers, his young face streaked with tears. He couldn't explain away. What happened here tonight? William demanded as the paramedics lifted Eleanor onto a stretcher. Where were you boys when your sister was hurt? We were in our rooms. Dad, Daniel answered smoothly. We didn't hear anything until you started yelling for Mum. She must have fallen down the back stairs, Michael added, delivering the lie they'd rehearsed. You know how steep they are. She probably got up to use the bathroom and lost her footing in the dark. William wanted to believe them. The alternative was too horrible to contemplate. But as he followed the ambulance to St. Mary's Hospital, something nagged at him. The boys' explanations felt rehearsed, too neat, too convenient. At the hospital, Eleanor was rushed into emergency surgery while William and Margaret waited in a sterile hallway that smelled of disinfectant and despair. The surgeon who eventually emerged to speak with them was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and tired features, Mr. and Mrs. Hayes. Dr. Patterson began carefully. Your daughter has suffered severe internal trauma. We've managed to stop the bleeding and stabilize her vital signs, but I need to discuss something very serious with you. William felt Margaret's hand grip his arm so tightly her nails drew blood. What is it? Doctor, will she be all right? Doctor. Patterson glanced around the busy emergency department before lowering his voice. The injuries your daughter sustained are consistent with violent sexual assault. This wasn't caused by a fall downstairs or any other accident. Someone did this to her deliberately, and it's been going on for some time based on the scarring we found during surgery. The words hit William like a physical blow. Margaret made a sound that was part scream, part sob, and collapsed into a nearby chair. The bustling emergency room seemed to fade away as William processed the doctor's words. Sexual assault. William's voice was barely a whisper. Are you certain? I'm afraid there's no doubt. Doctor, Patterson replied gently. We're required by law to contact the police in cases like this. Detective Morrison is already on his way to speak with you." William's world tilted on its axis. His little princess, his beloved daughter, had been violated while he was away earning money to support his family. The guilt hit him like a tidal wave, followed immediately by a rage so pure and consuming that he had to grip the arms of his chair to keep from destroying everything within reach. When Detective Morrison arrived an hour later, Eleanor was awake but heavily sedated. The detective was a weathered man in his 50s who'd seen enough human cruelty to recognize the signs immediately. "Eleanor," Detective Morrison said gently, pulling a chair close to her hospital bed. "I know this is difficult, but I need you to tell me who did this to you. Was it someone you know?" Eleanor's eyes darted to her parents, both of whom looked as if they'd aged years in a single night. William stood by the window with his hands clenched into fists, while Margaret sat beside the bed crying silently. The truth balanced on the tip of Eleanor's tongue. She could end this nightmare right now, could tell Detective Morrison exactly who had been torturing her for months. But the sight of her parents' devastated faces made her hesitate. How could she tell them that their sons, the boys they'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, were monsters? How could she be the one to destroy what remained of their family? It was some older boys, Eleanor whispered, the lie sliding out before she could stop it. "I don't know their names. They said they were from out of town." Detective Morrison's experienced eyes narrowed slightly. He'd heard enough lies from traumatized victims to recognize the signs, but he also knew better than to push too hard too soon. "Can you describe them for me, Eleanor? Anything you remember might help us find them." Eleanor's descriptions were vague and contradictory. The boys were tall, but not too tall, dark-haired, but maybe brown, wearing jeans, but she wasn't sure what shirts. With each question, her answers became more uncertain, more obviously fabricated. "Eleanor," Detective Morrison said finally, his voice gentle but firm, "I need you to understand something. If you don't tell me the truth, these men could hurt other girls. Is there anything else you want to tell me?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Eleanor looked at her father, saw the desperate hope in his eyes that this nightmare could be solved by catching some anonymous strangers. She looked at her mother, already broken by the knowledge that her daughter had been violated. How could she add the unbearable truth that the perpetrators were her own sons? "I told you everything I remember," Eleanor said finally, sealing her fate with another lie. Over the following week, as Eleanor recovered in the hospital, the investigation into her assault went nowhere. Police canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed Eleanor's classmates and teachers, and followed up on every lead, but found nothing. The description Eleanor had given could have matched dozens of young men in the area, and without more specific information, the case quickly went cold. Meanwhile, William threw himself into his own investigation with the fervor of a man seeking redemption. He spent hours at the police station, offering rewards for information and putting up posters with the vague composite sketch based on Eleanor's description. His guilt over being away when his daughter needed him most drove him to obsessive lengths. At home, the atmosphere was suffocating. Eleanor's brothers walked on eggshells, playing their roles as concerned siblings, while terror gnawed at them from within. They'd come closer to disaster than they'd ever imagined possible, and the knowledge that they were still in danger kept them awake at night. Daniel, still the leader, tried to maintain control over the situation. "We have to act normal," he told his brothers during a whispered conference in the garage. "We're the concerned big brothers helping our family through a crisis. If anyone suspects us, we're all finished." But the strain was showing on all of them. Christopher, the youngest, was barely eating and had developed a nervous tic that made his left eye twitch constantly. Michael had started drinking, stealing beer from neighbors' garages and consuming it in secret. Even Daniel, usually so controlled, found himself snapping at innocent questions and jumping at unexpected sounds. The tension in the house was palpable. William studied his sons with new eyes, looking for signs he'd missed, clues he should have seen. Margaret, devastated by guilt over failing to protect her daughter, began watching everyone with suspicion. "There's something that doesn't add up about Eleanor's story," William said one evening as he and Margaret sat in their bedroom with the door closed. "She can't describe her attackers. She can't remember where exactly it happened. And the boys? What about the boys?" Margaret asked. though her voice suggested she didn't want to hear the answer. They're acting strange. Margaret, Daniel can barely look me in the eye. Michael jumps every time I walk into a room. And Christopher, God, the kid looks like he hasn't slept in weeks. Margaret wanted to defend her sons, but she'd noticed the same things. They're upset about Eleanor. We all are. It's natural that they'd be affected by something this terrible happening to their sister. But even as she said the words, Margaret felt doubt creeping into her heart. Mothers were supposed to have instincts about these things, weren't they? How had she failed to notice that her daughter was being tortured? And why did her son seem more terrified than grieved? The breaking point came 3 weeks after Eleanor returned home from the hospital. William had taken extended leave from his trucking job, determined not to leave his family again until Eleanor's attackers were caught. He spent his days at home, watching, waiting, and slowly putting together pieces of a puzzle he desperately didn't want to solve. It was a Tuesday afternoon when everything finally unraveled. Margaret had gone to deliver alterations to Mrs. Patterson, following the same routine that had enabled the boys' abuse for months. Eleanor was in the living room, trying to concentrate on homework while William worked in his garage. Daniel, perhaps driven by hubris or maybe just unable to resist the opportunity, approached Eleanor as she sat at the coffee table with her math book open in front of her. "We need to talk, little sister," he said, his voice carrying that familiar undertone of menace that Eleanor had learned to fear. Eleanor immediately stood up, ready to run, but Daniel grabbed her arm with enough force to make her gasp in pain. "Sit down," he commanded. "We need to discuss some things about your story, about what you told the police." "Let go of me," Eleanor said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "Don't ever touch me again." Daniel's grip tightened. "You need to understand something. Dad's been asking questions. He's suspicious. If you can't keep your story straight, if you let anything slip, we're all going to pay the price." "I don't care," Eleanor said, tears streaming down her face. "You destroyed my life. Why should I care what happens to yours?" Daniel's face darkened with rage. "Because if we go down, we're taking you with us. We'll tell everyone that you wanted it, that you begged for it. Who do you think they'll believe?" He didn't get to finish his threat. The living room door burst open with such force that it slammed against the wall, and William Hayes stood there holding a manila folder, his face white with fury and heartbreak. William had just returned from the hospital, where he'd gone to collect copies of Eleanor's medical records to send to a specialist in Pittsburgh. What he'd read in those records had shattered the last of his illusions about what had happened to his daughter. "Get away from her," William said in a voice Eleanor had never heard before. It was quiet, controlled, but loaded with a violence that made the air in the room feel electric. Daniel released Eleanor's arm and took a step back, his hands raised in a gesture of false innocence. "Dad, it's not what you think. We were just talking about—" "I know exactly what you were talking about," William interrupted, throwing the folder onto the coffee table. Medical reports scattered across the surface, and Eleanor could see official letterheads and clinical terminology that described her violation in cold, scientific terms. "Do you know what these reports say?" "Daniel," William asked, advancing on his oldest son with the steady pace of a predator. "They say that Eleanor's injuries were consistent with repeated sexual assault over an extended period, not one attack by strangers, like she told us. Months of systematic abuse." Eleanor watched her father's face transform as the truth finally sank in completely. The gentle man who had carried her in his arms and called her his princess was disappearing, replaced by someone capable of terrible violence. "How long?" William asked, turning to Eleanor with tears streaming down his face. "How long did they hurt you while I was away?" "Since March," Eleanor whispered, the words barely audible. "Since you started taking the long routes to Ohio." The confession hung in the air like a death sentence. At that moment, Michael walked through the kitchen door, stopping dead when he saw the scene in the living room. His face went white as he took in the scattered medical reports, his father's expression, and Eleanor's tear-streaked face. "Where's Christopher?" William asked, his voice still carrying that terrifying calm. "I don't know," Michael stammered. "He was in his room earlier." "But it doesn't matter," William said, cutting him off. "Eleanor just told me the truth about who really hurt her." The explosion that followed was like nothing Eleanor had ever witnessed. William Hayes, the gentlest man she had ever known, became a force of pure destruction. Years of suppressed rage, months of impotent frustration, and the devastating betrayal by his own sons erupted all at once. William's first punch caught Daniel completely off guard, sending him crashing into the bookshelf. Years of physical labor had given William strength that his 19-year-old son couldn't match, and the fury driving him made him unstoppable. George, no. Margaret's voice cut through the chaos as she burst through the front door, drawn by the sounds of violence. But it was too late to stop what had been building for months. Michael tried to pull his father away from Daniel, but caught an elbow to the face that sent him reeling backward with blood streaming from his broken nose. Eleanor pressed herself against the wall, simultaneously terrified and fascinated by the sight of her father finally unleashing the protective rage she desperately needed months ago. Neighbors began arriving, drawn by the sounds of the fight and Margaret screaming. It took 3 grown men to finally restrain William, who continued struggling against their grip while shouting threats and accusations that left no doubt about what had been happening in the Hayes household. "He's lost his mind," someone said as the police sirens grew louder. "Somebody call for backup." But when the police officers entered the house and found Eleanor sobbing in the corner, when they saw Daniel's bloodied face and Michael's broken nose, when they heard William's broken explanation of what he'd discovered, the situation became clear with horrible precision. Detective Morrison, the same man who'd interviewed Eleanor weeks ago, knelt beside her with understanding in his eyes. "Eleanor, I need you to tell me the truth now, all of it. No more lies to protect anyone." And finally, with her father's protective rage still echoing in her ears, Eleanor found the courage to speak. The truth poured out of her like water from a broken dam. Every detail, every threat, every moment of violation and terror. She told them about the calculated timing, the psychological manipulation, the way her brothers had systematically destroyed her trust in her own perceptions. When she finished, the room was silent, except for Margaret's quiet sobbing. Daniel sat against the wall with his hands cuffed behind his back, blood still dripping from his split lip. Michael leaned against the opposite wall, holding a towel to his broken nose. And somewhere in the house, Christopher was hiding, knowing that his world was about to end. Christopher Hayes. Detective Morrison called out, "We need you to come out here right now." Christopher appeared from the basement, his young face streaked with tears and his entire body shaking. He looked like a broken child rather than one of Eleanor's tormentors. And for a moment, Eleanor felt something that might have been pity. "It's true," Christopher said before anyone could ask him a question. "Everything she said is true. I participated. I deserve to be arrested too." William, still being held by 2 officers, looked at his youngest son with an expression of such contempt and heartbreak that Christopher began sobbing even harder. "You are no longer my son," William said simply. "None of you are my sons." The words fell like a final judgment, marking the end of the Hayes family as they had known it. As Eleanor watched her brothers being led away in handcuffs, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. The possibility that this nightmare might finally be over. But even as relief flooded through her, Eleanor knew that the hardest part was yet to come. The truth was out now, but the consequences would ripple through their lives for years to come. The little girl who had been William Hayes's princess was gone forever, replaced by a young woman who would have to find a way to rebuild herself from the ashes of her destroyed childhood. Fan 3. Hậu quả và hành trình chữa lành. The aftermath of that terrible afternoon spread through Millbrook like wildfire. By evening, news vans lined Maple Street, their bright lights turning the Hayes family's modest white house into a circus of public shame. Reporters knocked on neighbors' doors, hungry for details about the family that had harbored such a dark secret. The story that emerged in the local newspapers was sensational and devastating. Brothers arrested in shocking family abuse case. Father's violent discovery leads to son's imprisonment. Small town. Rocked by unthinkable family horror, Eleanor watched from her bedroom window as strangers gathered on their front lawn, pointing and whispering about the house where such terrible things had happened. The sanctuary that had once been her home now felt like a fishbowl, with every window exposing their family's pain to public scrutiny. The legal proceedings moved with surprising speed. Daniel and Michael, both adults, were charged with multiple counts of sexual assault, kidnapping, and conspiracy. Their bail was set so high that William couldn't have afforded it even if he'd wanted to, which which he decidedly did not. Christopher, still technically a minor at 15, faced separate charges in juvenile court. Eleanor found herself at the center of a legal storm that felt almost as violating as the original abuse. Defense attorneys painted her as a troubled teenager seeking attention, suggesting that her delayed reporting proved the accusations were fabricated. The prosecutor, a stern woman named Janet Crawford, prepared Eleanor for the character assassination that was coming. "They're going to try to make you the villain in this story, Mrs. Crawford explained during one of their preparation sessions. "They'll say you seduced your brothers, that you enjoyed what happened, that you're lying now for attention or revenge. You need to be ready for that." Eleanor nodded, though the words felt like physical blows. Even now, even with the truth finally exposed, her brother's threats echoed in her mind. They'd promised that no one would believe her, and their lawyers seemed determined to make that prophecy come true. The trial began on a cold October morning in 1966. Eleanor wore a navy blue dress that Margaret had sewn specifically for the occasion, as if the right outfit could somehow armor her against what was coming. The courthouse was packed with spectators, many of them neighbors and classmates who looked at Eleanor with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Taking the witness stand was the most terrifying thing Eleanor had ever done. The defense attorney, a sharp-faced man named Robert Klein, circled her like a predator, his questions designed to confuse and intimidate. "Miss Hayes," he began with false gentleness, "isn't it true that you had romantic feelings for your brother Christopher, who was only 2 years older than you?" "No," Eleanor replied firmly, though her voice shook. "That's not true. But you shared intimate conversations with him, didn't you? You confided in him about your feelings and desires." "Mercy," Crawford objected, but the damage was done. Klein continued his assault, suggesting that Eleanor had misunderstood normal sibling affection, that her accusations were the product of a confused adolescent mind, seeking to explain her own inappropriate feelings. Eleanor felt herself shrinking under the attorney's relentless questioning. But then she saw her father in the gallery. William Hayes looked like he'd aged a decade in the past few months, but his eyes burned with unwavering support for his daughter. That look gave Eleanor the strength to sit up straighter and face her tormentor directly. "Mr. Klein," she said, interrupting his latest insinuation. "They held me down. They threatened to kill me if I told anyone. They planned when to attack me, based on when my parents would be away. Does that sound like consensual activity to you?" The courtroom fell silent. Klein, momentarily thrown off his rhythm, shuffled his papers and tried a different approach. But Eleanor had found her voice. For the next 2 hours, she methodically destroyed every attempt to paint her as anything other than what she was, a victim who had finally found the courage to speak. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Daniel and Michael were each sentenced to 12 years in state prison. Christopher, tried as a juvenile, received 6 years in a reform facility. The sentences felt both like justice and somehow inadequate for the months of hell Eleanor had endured. As the verdicts were read, Eleanor watched her brothers' faces. Daniel stared straight ahead, showing no emotion, already planning his next move. Michael broke down crying, perhaps finally understanding the magnitude of what he'd done. Christopher looked directly at Eleanor, his young face filled with a remorse that seemed genuine, but came far too late to matter. The trial's end brought no celebration, only exhaustion. The Hayes family had been dissected in public, their most private horrors displayed for the entertainment of strangers. Eleanor felt hollowed out, as if the legal proceedings had somehow finished what her brothers had started. Life in Millbrook became impossible after the trial. Everywhere Eleanor went, she felt the weight of stares and whispers. Some people looked at her with pity, others with the kind of morbid fascination reserved for accident victims. A few, influenced by the defense attorney's suggestions, regarded her with suspicion, as if she might have somehow brought this nightmare on herself. At school, the atmosphere was toxic. Eleanor's former friends didn't know how to act around her, torn between sympathy and the kind of uncomfortable fascination that made her feel like a specimen in a jar. Teachers spoke to her in artificially gentle voices, as if she might shatter at any moment. The hallways buzzed with whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she appeared. "Look, there's the girl whose brothers..." The sentence never needed to be finished. Everyone knew the story, and everyone had an opinion about it. Margaret Hayes, already fragile from the trauma of discovering her son's crimes, began suffering what could only be described as a complete nervous breakdown. She would spend hours staring at photographs of Daniel, Michael, and Christopher as children, trying to reconcile those innocent faces with the monsters they'd become. "How did I not know?" she would ask William over and over, her voice broken with guilt and confusion. How does a mother not see something like that happening under her own roof? William had no answers to give her. His own guilt was consuming him from the inside, eating away at his ability to function. The man who had once been the strong foundation of their family was crumbling under the weight of his perceived failures. "I should have been here," he would mutter, staring out the kitchen window at the neighbors who now crossed the street to avoid walking past their house. "I should have protected her. What kind of father was I?" The house on Maple Street, once filled with laughter and the comfortable sounds of family life, became a tomb. Eleanor would lie in bed at night listening to her mother's muffled sobs and her father's restless pacing, knowing that her decision to finally tell the truth had saved her, but destroyed what remained of their family. By Christmas of 1966, the situation had become unbearable. Eleanor found herself jumping at every unexpected sound, avoiding mirrors because she couldn't stand to see her own haunted reflection, and having panic attacks whenever she was alone in a room. The nightmares that had plagued her during the abuse continued, sometimes featuring her brothers but often starring the hostile faces of townspeople who blamed her for destroying a good family. It was William who finally suggested what they all knew was inevitable. "We need to leave this place," he announced one evening after Margaret had gone to bed early, claiming another headache. "There's nothing for us here but bad memories and people who will never let us forget what happened." Eleanor felt a mixture of relief and terror at the prospect. Millbrook held nothing but pain for her, but it was the only home she'd ever known. The idea of starting over somewhere else, of trying to rebuild their shattered family among strangers, seemed both impossible and absolutely necessary. "Where would we go?" Eleanor asked. William had already been researching the possibilities. His trucking company had offered him a transfer to their depot in Cedar Falls, a larger town about 4 hours away where nobody would know their story. "It's a college town," he explained, "more diverse, more accepting of newcomers. We could rent an apartment until we figure out what we want to do long term, make a fresh start." The decision was made with surprising speed. By February 1967, the Hayes family had packed their essential belongings and abandoned their house on Maple Street. They left behind furniture, photographs, and almost everything that could remind them of their previous life. It felt less like moving and more like fleeing, which Eleanor supposed was exactly what they were doing. Cedar Falls was everything Millbrook was not: bustling, anonymous, filled with young people attending the state university. Their small apartment near the campus was nothing like the house they'd left behind, but Eleanor found comfort in its bland neutrality. Here, she wasn't the girl whose brothers had violated her. She was just another new student trying to fit in. William found work in the transportation company's main office, a desk job that kept him home every night but paid less than his previous position. Margaret took a part-time job at a local bakery, finding some peace in the simple, repetitive task of kneading dough and decorating cakes. They were starting over with almost nothing, but for the first time in months, Eleanor felt like she could breathe. The new high school was larger and more impersonal than her school in Millbrook, which Eleanor considered a blessing. Here, she could blend into the crowd of students, just another quiet girl trying to get through her senior year. She kept to herself initially, eating lunch alone and avoiding the social groups that might ask too many questions about her past. But isolation, Eleanor discovered, had its own challenges. The silence she'd cultivated as protection began to feel like a prison. She would watch other students laughing with friends, going to dances and dating, and feel like she was observing life through thick glass, unable to participate in normal teenage experiences. It was her English teacher, Mrs. Davidson, who first noticed that Eleanor Hayes was more than just another shy transfer student. Mrs. Davidson was a woman in her 40s who had taught long enough to recognize students carrying heavy burdens. "Eleanor, I'd like you to stay after class for a moment," Mrs. Davidson said one afternoon in early spring. When the other students had filed out, she approached Eleanor's desk with a gentle smile. "I've been reading your essays," she began, and I'm struck by the maturity and insight in your writing. You have a gift for expressing complex emotions and ideas. Have you ever considered joining the school newspaper?" Eleanor shook her head. The last thing she wanted was to draw attention to herself or be required to interact with other students on a regular basis. Mrs. Davidson seemed to understand her reluctance. "You don't have to make a decision now, but I want you to know that your voice matters. Eleanor, you have something important to say, and someday you might find that sharing your story helps not just you, but others who have faced similar challenges." The suggestion planted a seed in Eleanor's mind. The idea that her experience, as painful as it had been, might somehow help other people was both terrifying and oddly comforting. She wasn't ready to share her story publicly, but the thought that it might have value beyond her own pain was revolutionary. As spring turned to summer, Eleanor began to venture out of her shell in small ways. She accepted an invitation to study with a classmate named Lisa, a quiet girl who didn't push for personal information. She started spending time in the local library, losing herself in books that transported her to worlds where terrible things didn't happen to innocent children. It was at the library that Eleanor first encountered serious literature about trauma and recovery. Books by authors who had survived their own horrors and found ways to transform their pain into something meaningful. She read about Holocaust survivors, victims of other forms of abuse, and people who had found ways to reclaim their lives after unthinkable experiences. One book in particular, written by a woman who had survived childhood sexual abuse, spoke directly to Eleanor's experience. The author wrote about the long journey from victim to survivor, about the way trauma could either destroy a person or become the foundation for extraordinary strength and compassion. Healing, the author wrote, is not about forgetting what happened or pretending it doesn't matter. It's about integrating the experience into your life story in a way that gives you power instead of taking it away. Eleanor read those words over and over, beginning to understand that she had a choice about how her story would end. She could remain trapped by what her brothers had done to her, or she could find a way to transform that experience into something that made her stronger. The first step in that transformation came in an unexpected way. Eleanor was volunteering at the library's summer reading program for children when she encountered a little girl named Sarah who reminded her painfully of herself at that age. Sarah was quiet, withdrawn, and flinched whenever adults approached her too quickly. Eleanor found herself spending extra time with Sarah, reading stories and helping with craft projects. There was something about the child's fearful demeanor that triggered Eleanor's protective instincts in a way nothing had since her own trauma. One afternoon, Sarah's mother came to pick her up and mentioned casually that they were dealing with some family difficulties that were affecting Sarah's behavior. The woman's carefully neutral tone and Sarah's immediate tension told Eleanor everything she needed to know. That night, Eleanor lay in bed thinking about Sarah and all the other children who might be suffering in silence. Just as she had, the realization that her experience had given her the ability to recognize signs that others might miss felt like a revelation. Maybe Mrs. Davidson had been right. Maybe her story did have value beyond her own healing. Eleanor began to consider what she wanted to do with her life beyond simply surviving it. The idea of working with children, of somehow using her experience to protect others, began to take shape in her mind. She started researching colleges with strong education programs, thinking about a career that would allow her to make a difference in young lives. When her senior year began, Eleanor took Mrs. Davidson's advice and joined the school newspaper. She didn't write about her own experience, but she found her voice in articles about social issues, about the importance of believing children who reported abuse, about the need for better support systems for trauma survivors. Her writing attracted attention from other students and teachers who were impressed by her insight and compassion. Slowly, carefully, Eleanor began to build relationships with peers who respected her privacy but valued her perspective. One of those peers was a boy named Thomas Anderson, a senior who worked on the newspaper's layout and design. Thomas was quiet like Eleanor, but his silence came from thoughtfulness rather than trauma. He had kind eyes and a gentle way of speaking that never made Eleanor feel pressured or uncomfortable. Their friendship developed slowly over months of working together on newspaper projects. Thomas never asked about Eleanor's past or pushed for information she wasn't ready to share. Instead, he talked about books, about his plans to study engineering in college, about his dreams of building things that would make the world better. "You're going to make an excellent teacher," he told Eleanor one afternoon as they worked on an article about literacy programs. "You have a way of explaining things that makes people feel safe to learn." The comment meant more to Eleanor than Thomas could have known. For so many months, she had felt broken, damaged, fundamentally changed in ways that made her less than whole. To have someone see her as capable of nurturing and protecting others was a gift she hadn't dared to hope for. As graduation approached, Eleanor realized that she had accomplished something she'd once thought impossible. She had built a new life. It wasn't the life she would have had if her brothers hadn't destroyed her innocence, but it was a life with purpose and possibility. The night before graduation, Eleanor received an unexpected letter. The return address was from the state juvenile facility where Christopher was serving his sentence. Eleanor stared at the envelope for a long time before deciding to open it. Christopher's letter was brief and written in the careful handwriting she remembered from their childhood. "Dear Eleanor, I know I have no right to contact you, and I don't expect you to respond. I just wanted you to know that not a day goes by that I don't think about what we did to you. I was young and stupid and scared. But those aren't excuses. There are no excuses for what happened. I'm getting help here. Therapy. Education. I'm trying to understand how I became someone who could hurt you the way I did. The counselors say that understanding might help me make sure I never hurt anyone again. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it, but I wanted you to know that I'm sorry and that I hope you've found a way to be happy despite what we took from you. I heard from someone in Millbrook that you and Mum and Dad moved away. I'm glad. I hope you can build a good life somewhere new. Your brother. I know I don't deserve to call myself that anymore. Christopher." Eleanor read the letter twice before folding it carefully and putting it in her dresser drawer. She didn't respond immediately, but she didn't throw it away either. Christopher's words couldn't undo the damage that had been done, but they represented something she hadn't expected: acknowledgement of the harm he'd caused and genuine remorse for his actions. The letter forced Eleanor to confront a question she'd been avoiding. What did forgiveness look like when the harm was so profound? She wasn't ready to forgive Christopher, might never be ready, but his letter suggested that he was at least trying to become someone worthy of forgiveness someday. Eleanor graduated third in her class and was accepted to several colleges with strong education programs. She chose State University partly because it was close enough for her to continue living with her parents, who still needed her support, and partly because their elementary education program had an excellent reputation. On the day she left for college, William drove her to campus in their aging sedan. As they pulled up to the dormitory where Eleanor would spend her freshman year, he turned to her with tears in his eyes. "I'm so proud of you, Princess," he said, using the childhood nickname that had once brought her such joy. "You've become an incredible young woman, despite everything that happened. Despite my failures as a father, you didn't fail me." "Dad," Eleanor replied, meaning it. "You saved me when I needed saving. That's what matters." William hugged her tightly, and for a moment they were just a father and daughter saying goodbye before a new chapter began. The tragedy that had defined their family was still there, would always be there, but it no longer defined everything they were or could become. As Eleanor walked toward her dormitory, carrying a single suitcase that contained everything she owned, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. The girl who had been destroyed in that kitchen in Millbrook was gone, but the woman who had emerged from that destruction was stronger than she'd ever imagined possible. College represented more than just education. It was proof that she could build a future that wasn't limited by her past. Eleanor Hayes was ready to discover who she could become when she was no longer defined solely as a victim of her brother's cruelty. Fan 4. Tái sinh và tha thứ. College life at State University opened up a world Eleanor had never imagined possible. For the first time since her childhood ended so abruptly, she found herself surrounded by people who knew nothing about her past. Her dorm mates saw her simply as Eleanor Hayes from Cedar Falls, a quiet but kind education major who always had time to help with homework or listen to their problems. Her roommate, Jennifer, was a bubbly psychology major from Chicago who filled their small dorm room with plants, colorful posters, and an endless stream of visitors. At first, Eleanor worried that Jennifer's outgoing personality would clash with her own need for privacy and quiet spaces. Instead, she discovered that Jennifer's warmth created a protective buffer around her, allowing Eleanor to participate in social activities without being the center of attention. "You should come to the mixer tonight," Jennifer would say, applying lipstick in their shared mirror. "There's going to be music and dancing. And I heard some really cute guys from the engineering building will be there." Eleanor usually declined these invitations, but she began joining Jennifer for smaller gatherings in their dormitory lounge. These casual conversations with other students her age felt revolutionary after years of isolation and careful self-protection. Her education classes proved to be both challenging and healing in unexpected ways. Professor Martinez's child development course introduced Eleanor to the scientific understanding of trauma and resilience. Learning about the psychological mechanisms behind abuse helped her understand her own experience in new ways. Children who experience trauma, Professor Martinez explained during one lecture, often develop hypervigilance and trust issues as survival mechanisms. But with proper support and understanding, these same children can develop extraordinary empathy and protective instincts toward others. Eleanor felt as if the professor was speaking directly to her. The hypervigilance that made her jump at unexpected sounds, the trust issues that made forming relationships so difficult, weren't character flaws or permanent damage. They were adaptations that had helped her survive, and they could be transformed into strengths that would make her a better teacher. During her sophomore year, Eleanor began working as a tutor in the university's literacy program for underprivileged children. The work brought her into contact with kids from difficult backgrounds, many of whom carried their own invisible wounds. She found that her own experience, painful as it had been, gave her unique insight into the signs that other adults might miss. There was Marcus, an 8-year-old who flinched whenever men raised their voices. There was Amy, a 10-year-old who had stopped speaking after her parents' violent divorce. There was David, whose academic struggles masked the chaos of living with an alcoholic father. Eleanor worked with these children with patience and understanding that came from hard-won experience. She never shared her own story with them, but they seemed to sense that she understood their pain in ways that other adults didn't. Miss Hayes really gets it. She overheard Amy tell another tutor one afternoon, "She doesn't make me talk about stuff I don't want to talk about, but she knows when I'm sad." The comment filled Eleanor with a sense of purpose she'd never experienced before. Her trauma, which had once felt like nothing but destruction and loss, was becoming a tool for helping others. The realization that her worst experiences could be transformed into her greatest strength felt like a kind of miracle. It was during her junior year that Eleanor met Thomas Anderson. Though their first encounter was far from romantic, Thomas was a senior engineering student who had volunteered to help repair playground equipment at the elementary school where Eleanor was doing her student teaching. She first noticed him because of how carefully he worked, checking each bolt and measurement multiple times to ensure the children's safety. When a group of excited third graders surrounded him, demanding to know how the slide worked and why swings moved the way they did, Thomas patiently explained the physics in terms they could understand. "Are you going to be a teacher too?" Eleanor asked him after the children had gone back to class. Thomas laughed, a warm sound that made something flutter in Eleanor's chest. "No, I'm terrible with kids usually, but there's something about seeing their curiosity that makes me want to explain everything I know about how the world works." Their conversation continued over coffee in the university cafeteria, where Eleanor learned that Thomas was studying structural engineering because he wanted to design buildings that could withstand natural disasters. His motivation came from a childhood spent in tornado country, where he'd seen too many families lose everything to storms. "I want to build things that protect people," he said simply. "Homes and schools and hospitals that won't fall down when the worst happens." Eleanor was struck by the parallel between their chosen careers. They both wanted to create safety for others. Though Thomas worked with concrete and steel, while Eleanor worked with young minds and wounded hearts, their friendship developed slowly over months of study sessions and long walks around campus. Thomas never pushed for more personal information than Eleanor was willing to share, never made her feel uncomfortable or pressured. When she finally told him, during their senior year, that she'd experienced trauma in her past and wasn't sure she'd ever be ready for a romantic relationship, His response surprised her. "Eleanor," he said gently, "I've known since the day we met that you'd been hurt badly by someone. It's there in the way you position yourself near exits, in how you watch people's hands when they talk, in the way you protect those kids you work with like a mother bear, protecting her cubs." Eleanor felt panic rise in her chest. If Thomas could see her damage so clearly, how long before he decided she was too broken to be worth his time? But Thomas continued, his voice steady and reassuring. "What I also see is someone who turned that hurt into incredible strength and compassion. I don't need to know the details of what happened to you. I just need you to know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be here. And if you're never ready, that's okay too. Your friendship means everything to me." The conversation marked a turning point in Eleanor's healing. For the first time since her childhood ended, someone had seen her scars and chosen to value her, not despite them, but because of the person they'd helped her become. Eleanor graduated summa cum laude in May 1971 with a degree in elementary education. William and Margaret drove up for the ceremony, both looking older but somehow lighter than they had in years. Margaret had found stability working at the bakery, and the simple routine of creating beautiful cakes and pastries had helped heal something deep inside her. William had been promoted to dispatcher at the trucking company, a job that kept him home every night but still connected him to the world of transportation he loved. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart," Margaret whispered as she hugged Eleanor after the ceremony. "You've built something beautiful from all that pain." The summer after graduation, Eleanor received letters from both Daniel and Michael. She was now 23 years old, mature enough to handle contact with her brothers without the crushing fear that had once silenced her. Daniel's letter was cold and calculating, even from prison. "Eleanor, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted you to know that I don't accept responsibility for what happened between us. You were 30, but you weren't a child. You knew what you were doing, and you made choices. The fact that you've turned this into some victim story for attention doesn't change the reality of what actually happened. I'll be released in 2 years, and I want you to know that I harbor no ill will toward you, despite what your accusations cost me. I hope you've gotten the attention you wanted from all this. Daniel." Eleanor read the letter twice, then tore it into small pieces and threw it away. Daniel's refusal to accept responsibility for his actions told her everything she needed to know about whether he'd changed during his incarceration. He remained dangerous, unrepentant, and entirely focused on his own perspective. Michael's letter was different. "Eleanor, I don't know if you'll read this, and I wouldn't blame you if you threw it away without opening it. I've been thinking about writing to you for years, but I could never find the words. I want you to know that I understand now what we did to you. I've been in therapy here, trying to understand how I became someone who could hurt his own sister. The therapist says that understanding isn't the same as forgiveness, and that I have no right to expect forgiveness from you. I was 17 when it started, old enough to know right from wrong. I chose to follow Daniel instead of protecting you. I chose to participate instead of getting help. I chose to threaten you instead of taking responsibility. Every one of those choices was mine. And they were all wrong. I know this doesn't change anything. I know it doesn't undo the harm we caused. But I wanted you to know that someone who hurt you has learned to see clearly what that hurt meant. I hope that knowledge gives you some small measure of peace. I don't expect you to respond to this letter. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to acknowledge that you deserved protection instead of harm, love instead of violence, brothers who would have died to keep you safe instead of brothers who chose to destroy your safety. I'm sorry, Eleanor. I'm so terribly sorry. Michael. Eleanor kept Michael's letter, reading it several times over the following weeks. His acknowledgement of responsibility and genuine remorse couldn't undo the damage he'd helped cause, but it offered something she hadn't expected, validation that her trauma had been real and undeserved. In September 1971, Eleanor began her teaching career at Riverside Elementary School, a diverse school in Cedar Falls that served children from various economic backgrounds. Her first grade classroom became a haven for students who needed extra patience and understanding. Principal Johnson, who had hired Eleanor based on her outstanding recommendations and her evident compassion for children, was impressed by her immediate impact on even the most challenging students. There's something special about Miss Hayes, he told the other teachers during a staff meeting. She has an intuitive understanding of which children need extra support, and she knows how to provide it without making them feel singled out or different. Eleanor's reputation as a teacher who could reach troubled children spread throughout the school district. Parents requested her specifically for children who had experienced trauma, divorce, or other disruptions. Eleanor never disclosed her own history, but her colleagues noticed that she seemed to understand these children in ways that textbooks couldn't teach. One of her students that first year was a little girl named Sarah, who reminded Eleanor painfully of herself at that age. Sarah was quiet, withdrawn, and displayed signs of anxiety that went beyond normal childhood shyness. During parent conferences, Eleanor learned that Sarah's family was dealing with some difficulties at home that were affecting the child's behavior. Eleanor began staying after school to work with Sarah individually, using art therapy and play techniques to help the child express feelings she couldn't put into words. Slowly, Sarah began to open up, creating drawings that depicted families in conflict and children hiding in small, dark spaces. Miss Hayes, Sarah said one afternoon while working on a painting of a house with all the windows covered. Sometimes grown-ups hurt kids even when they're not supposed to. Right, Eleanor's heart clenched, but she kept her voice steady and gentle. Yes, sweetheart, sometimes that happens, but it's never the child's fault when grown-ups make bad choices. The conversation led to a careful investigation that ultimately revealed Sarah was being abused by an uncle who lived with the family. Eleanor's recognition of the signs and her patient work with Sarah led to the child's protection and the uncle's prosecution. Cases like Sarah's reinforced Eleanor's sense that her own trauma had been transformed into a tool for protecting others. The hypervigilance that made her own life difficult also made her extraordinarily sensitive to signs of abuse in her students. In 1973, Thomas graduated with his engineering degree and took a job with a construction company in Cedar Falls. Their relationship had evolved slowly and carefully, built on mutual respect and understanding rather than passion alone. When Thomas proposed that winter, kneeling in Eleanor's childhood bedroom, while William and Margaret watched tearfully from the doorway, Eleanor felt ready to build a life with someone who had proven his patience and devotion over years rather than months. I know marriage might be scary for you, Thomas said as he offered her a simple but beautiful ring. I know intimacy might always be complicated because of what you experienced, but I love you exactly as you are, and I want to build whatever kind of life feels safe and happy for you. Eleanor's wedding to Thomas Anderson in June 1974 was a small ceremony attended by family and close friends. She wore a dress that Margaret had sewn with love and tears and walked down the aisle on William's arm while thinking about how different her life might have been if her brothers had chosen protection instead of predation. The early years of their marriage were indeed complicated by Eleanor's trauma history. Physical intimacy required patience, communication, and sometimes professional help from a counselor who specialized in trauma recovery. But Thomas proved as steady and understanding as he'd promised, never pressuring Eleanor beyond her comfort level and celebrating every small step forward in her healing journey. In 1976, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. The doctors had warned that the internal damage from her childhood abuse might affect her ability to conceive or carry a pregnancy to term. The news that she was expecting a healthy baby felt like a miracle that completed her transformation from victim to survivor. Mary Anderson was born in March 1977, a healthy baby girl with Thomas's calm temperament and Eleanor's expressive eyes. Holding her daughter for the first time, Eleanor felt a fierce protectiveness that went beyond normal maternal instincts. This child would never experience the betrayal and violation that had marked Eleanor's own childhood. She's perfect, Eleanor whispered as she counted Mary's tiny fingers and toes. She's absolutely perfect, and she's going to be safe always. 2 years later, Eleanor gave birth to Peter, followed by Anna in 1982. Each child brought new dimensions to Eleanor's healing, as she discovered that creating safety and love for her own children helped heal the wounded child that still lived inside her heart. Eleanor's reputation as an exceptional teacher continued to grow throughout the 1980s. She developed innovative programs for helping traumatized children, wrote articles for education journals about recognizing signs of abuse, and trained other teachers in trauma-informed classroom practices. In 1985, she received an unexpected visitor at school. Christopher, now 25 and recently released from the juvenile facility where he'd served his sentence, appeared in her classroom doorway after school hours. Eleanor's first instinct was panic, but she quickly recognized that the man standing before her bore little resemblance to the 15-year-old boy who had participated in her abuse. Christopher was thin, nervous, and kept his hands visible at all times, in a way that suggested he understood how his presence might affect her. "I'm sorry to surprise you like this," he said immediately. "I know I should have called or written first. I wanted to see if you were okay. If you'd built a good life." Eleanor studied her youngest brother's face, looking for signs of the cruelty that had once lived there. What she saw instead was genuine remorse, anxiety about her reaction, and a desperate hope for some sign that his presence wasn't causing her distress. "I'm fine, Christopher," she said carefully. "I'm married, I have children, and I love my work. I've built a good life." Christopher's relief was visible. I'm so glad. I know what we did to you was unforgivable, but I've spent the last 10 years learning to understand why I participated and making sure I never hurt anyone again." Their conversation lasted less than an hour, during which Christopher told Eleanor about his education in the juvenile facility, his ongoing therapy, and his work with organizations that helped prevent child abuse. He didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't request a place in her life, and didn't minimize the harm he'd helped cause. "I just wanted you to know," he said as he prepared to leave, "that someone who hurt you has spent every day since then trying to become someone worthy of the sister he once had. I know I can never make up for what I took from you, but I wanted you to see that your courage in speaking the truth changed at least one life for the better." Eleanor never saw Christopher again after that meeting, but she learned through mutual acquaintances that he'd married a woman who knew about his past, become a father himself, and dedicated his career to working with at-risk youth. His transformation didn't erase the harm he'd helped cause, but it offered Eleanor a sense of closure she hadn't expected to find. In 1990, Eleanor received news that Daniel had died in a prison fight. She felt neither grief nor satisfaction at the news, only a sense that a dangerous chapter in her story had finally closed permanently. Michael was released that same year, but moved to California and made no attempt to contact her, which Eleanor considered a kindness. The years that followed brought the ordinary joys and challenges of a life well lived. Eleanor and Thomas raised their 3 children with love, patience, and an unwavering commitment to their safety and happiness. Mary became a doctor, Peter an engineer like his father, and Anna a social worker who specialized in helping children from troubled families. Eleanor's grandchildren brought new dimensions to her healing. Watching Mary, Peter, and Anna raised their own children with love and security, seeing the cycle of trauma broken permanently, felt like the ultimate victory over the forces that had once tried to destroy her. In 2010, at the age of 58, Eleanor made a decision that surprised even herself. She began writing a book about her experience, not for publication, but for her children and grandchildren, who would someday want to understand the source of her extraordinary strength and compassion. The writing process was difficult, forcing Eleanor to revisit memories she'd worked for decades to integrate and understand, but it was also liberating, allowing her to tell her story on her own terms, as a tale of survival and transformation, rather than simply victimization. "Why are you writing this now, Mom?" Anna asked during one of their regular Sunday dinners. "You've spent your whole life being private about what happened to you." Eleanor looked around the table at her family. Thomas, still steady and loving after nearly 40 years of marriage. Her 3 children, all successful adults who'd grown up feeling secure and protected. Her 7 grandchildren, innocent and joyful in the way she'd once been. "Because I want them to understand," she said, nodding toward the grandchildren who were playing in the living room. "Someday they'll be old enough to wonder why Grandma Eleanor jumps when people come up behind her, why she always sits where she can see all the exits, why she chose to work with hurt children. I want them to know that terrible things can happen to good people, but that those terrible things don't have to define what happens next. She paused, watching her youngest grandson build a tower with blocks, completely absorbed in his innocent play. I want them to know that love is stronger than cruelty, that healing is possible, and that sometimes the worst things that happen to us can become the source of our greatest gifts to others. Eleanor never published her book, but she shared it with her children when they were ready to understand it fully. The story became part of their family's oral history, a testament to the power of survival, the importance of breaking cycles of harm, and the possibility of transformation even after the deepest wounds. At 73, Eleanor Hayes Anderson looked back on her life with a sense of completion she'd never expected to feel. The 13-year-old girl who had been broken in that kitchen in Millbrook had grown into a woman who'd protected hundreds of children, raised a loving family, and transformed her deepest trauma into her greatest strength. The scars remained, would always remain, but they had become part of a larger story about resilience, healing, and the extraordinary capacity of the human spirit to create light from darkness. Eleanor's life stood as proof that even the worst betrayals couldn't destroy the fundamental human capacity for love, growth, and service to others. The most important thing I want people to understand, Eleanor wrote in the final pages of her memoir, is that survival is only the beginning. The real victory comes when you discover that your wounds can become the source of wisdom you use to heal others. When you realize that your worst experiences can become your greatest gifts to the world, you've transformed from victim to victor to healer. And that transformation is available to anyone willing to do the hard work of healing. As Eleanor closed her notebook and looked out at her garden, where grandchildren played in safety and joy, she knew that her story, painful as it had been to live and difficult as it remained to tell, had found its proper ending, not in bitterness or destruction, but in love, protection, and the quiet satisfaction of a life dedicated to ensuring that other children would be spared the darkness she had endured. The little girl, who had once been William Hayes's princess, was gone. But in her place stood a woman who had become something even more powerful, a guardian of innocence, a healer of wounds, and living proof that no darkness is so deep that it cannot eventually give birth to light. Her legacy would live on in the hundreds of children she had taught and protected, in her own children and grandchildren who grew up safe and loved, in the other teachers she had trained to recognize the signs of abuse, in the policies she had helped create to protect vulnerable children. Eleanor Hayes Anderson had taken the worst thing that could happen to a child and transformed it into a force for good in the world. She had broken the cycle of trauma. She had chosen healing over hatred. She had built a life of meaning and purpose from the ashes of her destroyed childhood. And in doing so, she had proven that the human spirit is stronger than any force that tries to break it. That love is more powerful than cruelty. That hope can grow even in the darkest soil. That sometimes our greatest wounds become our greatest gifts to the world. Fan 4. Tái sinh và tha thứ. Eleanor Hayes stood at the altar on June 15, 1974. Her white dress was simple but elegant. Margaret had sewn every stitch with trembling hands. William walked his daughter down the aisle with tears in his eyes. Thomas Anderson waited at the altar. His face glowed with patient love. He had waited 3 years for this moment. 3 years of gentle courtship, 3 years of proving his devotion without demanding anything in return. "Do you take this woman to be your wife?" the minister asked. "I do," Thomas replied. His voice was steady and sure. Eleanor looked into his kind eyes. For the first time in a decade, she felt truly safe. "I do," she whispered back. The wedding was small, only 20 guests attended, but the love in that little church felt infinite. Their honeymoon was spent in a quiet cabin by a lake. Thomas had chosen it carefully. No crowded hotels, no unexpected visitors, just peace and privacy for his wounded bride. "We have all the time in the world," he told Eleanor on their first night. "There's no rush for anything. We'll build our life together one day at a time." Eleanor cried then, happy tears mixed with relief. She had found a man who understood that healing couldn't be rushed. The first year of marriage brought challenges. Eleanor still jumped at unexpected sounds. She still positioned herself near exits in restaurants. Some nights, nightmares would wake them both. But Thomas never complained. He simply held her when she needed comfort. He gave her space when she needed solitude. He proved every day that love could be patient and kind. In 1976, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. The news terrified her at first. What if she couldn't protect her child? What if the trauma had damaged her ability to love properly? Dr. Patterson, their family physician, was gentle but honest. The internal scarring might cause complications, he warned. We'll monitor the pregnancy very closely. Eleanor spent those 9 months in constant fear, but Thomas remained her rock. He read parenting books aloud to her. He painted the nursery pale yellow because they wanted to be surprised. He talked to her belly every night, telling their unborn child how loved they already were. Mary Anderson was born on March the 3rd, 1977, 7 pounds. 2 ounces of perfect health. Eleanor held her daughter for the first time and felt something break open in her chest. Not pain this time, but pure, overwhelming love. She's beautiful, Thomas whispered, tears streaming down his face. She looks just like her mother. Eleanor stared at Mary's tiny fingers, her perfect little nose, her peaceful sleeping face. I'll never let anyone hurt you, she promised in a voice only Thomas could hear. Never. Motherhood healed Eleanor in ways therapy never could. Every diaper changed was an act of love. Every midnight feeding was a chance to prove that she could nurture instead of being destroyed. Every smile from Mary was evidence that Eleanor could create joy in the world. Peter arrived 2 years later, then Anna in 1982. Monday, May 2. Each child brought new dimensions to Eleanor's healing. She discovered that her hypervigilance, once a symptom of trauma, now made her an extraordinarily protective mother. She noticed things other parents missed. The way Peter's teacher spoke too sharply to shy children, the playground bully who targeted the smallest kids, the neighbor whose jokes made Anna uncomfortable. How do you always know? Thomas asked one evening after Eleanor had quietly addressed a problem at Anna's school. When you've been hurt the way I was, Eleanor said softly, you develop radar for danger. I can spot predators from a mile away. Eleanor's teaching career flourished alongside her family life. She became known throughout Cedar Falls as the teacher who could reach troubled children. Parents specifically requested her for kids who had experienced trauma. Her classroom was a sanctuary, soft lighting, comfortable reading corners, art supplies always available for children who couldn't express their pain in words. Eleanor understood that healing happened differently for every child. One student, Marcus, reminded her painfully of herself at that age. He flinched when adults raised their voices. He hoarded snacks in his desk. He drew pictures of dark houses with all the windows covered. Eleanor worked with Marcus patiently. She never pushed for information he wasn't ready to share. Instead, she created safety through routine and predictability. She made sure he knew that her classroom was a place where no one would hurt him. Slowly, Marcus began to open up. Through careful questioning and observation, Eleanor realized the boy was being abused by his stepfather. Her report to Child Protective Services likely saved Marcus's life. You have a gift, Principal Johnson told her after Marcus was placed in a safe foster home. You see what others miss. Eleanor nodded. It's not a gift I would have chosen, she replied, but I'm grateful I can use it to help others. As the years passed, Eleanor's reputation grew beyond Cedar Falls. She spoke at education conferences about recognizing signs of abuse. She trained other teachers in trauma-informed practices. She wrote articles for professional journals about creating healing environments for hurt children. But it was a letter that arrived in 1985 that truly tested Eleanor's growth. The return address read, Christopher Hayes, General Delivery, Pittsburgh, PA. Eleanor stared at the envelope for a full hour before opening it. Her youngest brother had been released from juvenile detention. He was now 25 years old. Dear Eleanor, the letter began. I know I have no right to contact you. I know you probably never want to see me again, but I had to try to tell you how sorry I am. Christopher's handwriting was careful and neat, very different from the scrawled notes he'd passed in school as a boy. I've spent the last 10 years in therapy, he continued, not just because it was required, but because I needed to understand how I became someone who could hurt you. The person I was at 15 was sick and twisted. The person I am now sees clearly what we did to you. Eleanor's hands shook as she read on. I know there's no excuse for what I participated in. I was old enough to know right from wrong. I was old enough to get help instead of joining in. I chose to be a predator instead of a protector. That choice will haunt me for the rest of my life. The letter was 3 pages long. Christopher detailed his education in detention, his ongoing therapy, his work with a program that helped other juvenile offenders understand the impact of their crimes. "I don't expect forgiveness," he concluded. "I don't deserve it, but I wanted you to know that your courage in speaking the truth saved not just yourself, but also saved me from becoming the monster I was turning into. I hope you found happiness. I hope you found peace. You deserved so much better than the brothers you got." Eleanor read the letter 3 times before showing it to Thomas. "What do you think?" she asked her husband. Thomas considered carefully. "I think people can change," he said finally. "But I also think you don't owe him anything. Not forgiveness, not a response, not even the benefit of the doubt." Eleanor folded the letter and put it in her desk drawer. She wasn't ready to respond, but she wasn't ready to throw it away either. 2 years later, another letter arrived. This one from Michael. Michael's letter was shorter, but equally sincere. He had been released from prison and was living in California. Like Christopher, he was in therapy. Like Christopher, he wasn't asking for forgiveness. "I just wanted you to know that I understand now what we took from you." Michael wrote, "Not just your innocence, but your sense of safety in the world, your ability to trust, your childhood joy. I understand that these things can never be given back." Eleanor kept Michael's letter too. She wasn't sure why. Perhaps as evidence that people could change. Perhaps as proof that evil wasn't always permanent. Daniel never wrote. Eleanor learned through family friends that he had died in prison in 1990. A fight with another inmate. She felt neither grief nor satisfaction at the news, just a sense that a dangerous chapter had finally closed. In 1995, Eleanor made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She wrote back to Christopher. Her letter was brief. "Christopher, I received your letters. I appreciate your honesty about what you did. I'm glad you've gotten help. I want you to know that I've built a good life, despite what happened. I have a loving husband, 3 wonderful children, and meaningful work. I've found happiness. That's all I wanted you to know, Eleanor." She mailed the letter before she could change her mind. Christopher's response came quickly. He thanked her for responding. He told her about his job working with at-risk youth. He mentioned that he had married a woman who knew about his past and loved him anyway. He had become a father himself. "Becoming a parent made me understand even more how unforgivable what we did was." He wrote, "The idea of anyone hurting my daughter the way we hurt you makes me physically sick. I can't imagine how Dad felt when he found out." Eleanor found herself corresponding with Christopher occasionally over the years. Not frequently, not intimately, but with a cautious respect for the man he had become. Michael remained in California and never reached out again after that first letter. Eleanor respected his choice to stay away. The children grew up knowing something terrible had happened to their mother when she was young, but they knew it in age-appropriate ways. As toddlers, they knew Mommy sometimes got sad and needed extra hugs. As children, they knew bad men had hurt Mummy before Daddy came along to keep her safe. As teenagers, they learned the full truth. "How do you not hate them?" Anna asked when she was 17, and Eleanor had finally shared the complete story. Eleanor considered the question carefully. "Hate is poison," she said finally. "It hurts the person carrying it more than anyone else. I decided a long time ago that I wouldn't let them poison my life any more than they already had." "But don't you want revenge?" Peter asked. "My revenge," Eleanor replied, "is living well. My revenge is raising children who are safe and loved. My revenge is protecting other children from experiencing what I experienced. My revenge is proving that victims can become victors." Mary, always the most thoughtful of the 3, asked the hardest question. "Do you forgive Uncle Christopher?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. "I don't think about forgiveness the way most people do," she said finally. "I don't forgive him for what he did. That was unforgivable. But I accept that he's genuinely sorry. I accept that he's worked to become a better person. And I accept that holding on to anger would only hurt me." The grandchildren began arriving in the late 1990s. Mary's daughter Sarah, Peter's twins, Emma and Jake, Anna's boys, Michael and David. Then Mary's son Thomas, named for Grandpa. Finally, Anna's youngest, little Eleanor. Watching her children raise their own children with love and security was perhaps Eleanor's greatest victory. The cycle of trauma had been permanently broken. Her grandchildren would grow up knowing only safety and love. "Look at what you built," Thomas said one Sunday afternoon as they watched their 7 grandchildren play in the backyard. "Look at all this joy and love that exists because you survived." Eleanor smiled, watching 4-year-old Eleanor chase butterflies while her cousins built sandcastles. "It wasn't just about surviving," she corrected gently. "It was about choosing to thrive." In 2005, Eleanor received an unexpected phone call. Christopher's voice was older, more tired, but still recognizable. "Eleanor, I'm calling because I have cancer," he said without preamble. "The doctors say I have maybe 6 months. I wondered if I could see you, just once, to say goodbye properly." Eleanor's first instinct was to say no, but something in his voice stopped her. This wasn't the manipulative boy who had helped destroy her childhood. This was a dying man seeking closure. "All right," she said finally, "but Thomas comes with me, and we meet in a public place." They met at a restaurant in Pittsburgh. Christopher looked older than his 55 years. The cancer had already taken its toll, but his eyes were clear and honest in a way they had never been when he was young. "Thank you for coming," he said, as Eleanor and Thomas sat across from him. "I know this is difficult for you." Eleanor studied her youngest brother's face. The cruelty that had once lived there was gone, replaced by something that looked like wisdom earned through pain. "How are your children?" she asked. Christopher's face lit up. "Jenny is 22 now. She's a teacher. Actually, like you. My son Mark is 19. He's studying social work." He paused. "They both know about what I did when I was young. They know about you. What do they think about it?" Thomas asked. "They're horrified." Christopher replied honestly, "But they also see how hard I've worked to become someone worthy of being their father. Jenny says I taught her to recognize predators by being honest about what I once was." The conversation lasted 2 hours. Christopher talked about his work with troubled youth, his marriage to a woman who had also survived childhood trauma, his ongoing therapy, which he'd continued for 30 years. "I never stopped trying to understand how I could have done what I did," he said. "I never stopped working to make sure I never hurt anyone again." Eleanor listened quietly. When Christopher finished speaking, she was silent for a long moment. "I'm glad you got help," she said finally. "I'm glad you became a better person. I'm glad you used your experience to help other kids." "Does that mean?" Christopher began hopefully. "It means I'm glad," Eleanor interrupted gently. "That's all it means." Christopher nodded, understanding. "That's enough," he said. "That's more than I deserved." They parted without embracing, without declarations of forgiveness or love, but with a sense of completion that neither had expected to find. Christopher died 4 months later. Eleanor attended his funeral. Sitting in the back with Thomas, she watched his wife and children grieve for the man he had become, not the boy he had been. She saw the young people he had mentored over the years, who spoke about how he had saved their lives by sharing his story. He did become a better person, Thomas observed as they drove home. "Yes," Eleanor agreed, "but that doesn't undo what he took from me. It just means something good eventually came from something terrible." Eleanor retired from teaching in 2010 at the age of 58. She had taught for 39 years and touched the lives of thousands of children. Her farewell party filled the school gymnasium with former students, grateful parents, and colleagues who considered her a mentor. "Mrs. Anderson saved my life," said Marcus, now a successful businessman with children of his own. "She saw what no one else saw and made sure I got the help I needed." Similar testimonials filled the evening. Child after child whose lives had been changed by Eleanor's ability to recognize pain and provide healing. In retirement, Eleanor finally had time to process her own journey fully. She began writing her memoirs, not for publication, but for her family. She wanted her children and grandchildren to understand the source of her strength. "Why write it down now?" Mary asked during one of their weekly coffee dates. "Because I want them to know the whole story," Eleanor replied. "I want them to understand that terrible things can happen to good people, but those terrible things don't have to define what happens next." She also wanted them to know that healing was possible, that love could overcome cruelty. that victims could become victors. The writing process was difficult, but liberating. Eleanor found herself able to examine her experiences with the wisdom of age and the perspective of someone who had truly overcome. The most important thing I learned, she wrote in one chapter, is that survival is only the beginning. The real victory comes when you discover that your wounds can become the source of wisdom you use to heal others. On her 73rd birthday, surrounded by her 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and Thomas, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The frightened 13-year-old girl who had been broken in that kitchen in Millbrook was gone. In her place sat a woman who had protected hundreds of children, raised a loving family, and transformed her deepest trauma into her greatest gift to the world. "What are you thinking about, Grandma L?" asked little Eleanor. Now 8 years old and full of the same curiosity her grandmother had once possessed, Eleanor pulled her youngest granddaughter onto her lap. "I'm thinking about how much joy you can create in the world when you choose love over hate," she said. "What do you mean?" the child asked. Eleanor looked around at her family. At Thomas, still devoted after 47 years of marriage. At her children, all successful and happy adults. At her grandchildren, innocent and secure in the way she had once been. "I mean that no matter how dark things get," Eleanor said softly, "there's always a choice. You can let the darkness win, or you can choose to be a light for others." Little Eleanor considered this seriously. "You chose to be a light, didn't you, Grandma?" Eleanor hugged her granddaughter tight. "Yes, sweetheart, I chose to be a light." As the birthday celebration continued around them, Eleanor felt a deep sense of completion. Her story, which had begun with such terrible darkness, had found its proper ending in love, joy, and the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. The scars remained. They would always remain. But they had become part of a larger story about resilience, healing, and the extraordinary capacity of the human spirit to create beauty from ashes. Eleanor Hayes Anderson had taken the worst thing that could happen to a child and transformed it into a force for good in the world. She had broken the cycle of trauma. She had chosen healing over hatred. She had built a life of meaning and purpose from the destruction of her childhood innocence. And in doing so, she had proven that love is stronger than cruelty. That hope can grow in the darkest soil. That sometimes our greatest wounds become our greatest gifts to the world. The little girl who had once been William Hayes's princess was gone forever, but in her place stood something even more powerful, a guardian of innocence, a healer of wounds, and living proof that no darkness is so deep that it cannot eventually give birth to light. Her legacy lived on in every child she had taught and protected, in her own children and grandchildren who grew up safe and loved, in the teachers she had mentored, in the policies she had helped create to protect vulnerable children. Eleanor Hayes Anderson had won, not through revenge or hatred, but through the simple, revolutionary act of choosing love over fear, healing over bitterness, hope over despair. And as she sat surrounded by the family she had created and protected, Eleanor knew that this was the truest victory of all, the proof that goodness could triumph over evil, that love could overcome cruelty, and that even the most broken hearts could learn to beat with joy again. The story that had begun in a kitchen in Millbrook with violence and betrayal had ended in a living room in Cedar Falls with laughter, love, and the innocent questions of a child who would never know the kind of fear her grandmother had once endured. That transformation was Eleanor's greatest gift to the world, proof that no matter how dark the beginning, a story could still find its way to light.